Well, folks, you know you're in for a treat when you hear that tune because it's time for another edition of the Rec Poker Podcast. I'm your host, Jim Reed, Bluff Serini in the home game and at Rec Poker Jim on Twitter. But I am just one of the members of the Wrecking Crew. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Rec Poker is all about the Wrecking Crew. This is the core team of people that make all the magic happen here. I'm proud to be a member, but if you want to find out more about me and the other members of the Wrecking Crew, you can go to rec.poker/crew, or you can just listen up because you're going to meet a few of them right here tonight.
I'm Chris Jones. You can find me 5B5 on Twitter or 5x5 in the Poker Stars home game.
I'm Kim Kilroy. I am PatVet_33 on Twitter. I am Fergie56 in the home game.
And I'm Rob Washam, and I'm Rabman50 just about everywhere.
And, of course, you have to thank the Wrecking Crew, but we also have to thank our premium members. Most of what we do here is free. We're a largely volunteer-based organization, but we go real deep into the strategy element of things for our premium members, and we have some fun social activities that go on throughout the month as well. So I'd encourage folks, if you want to support us and say thanks for putting on the show and all the other fun stuff that we do, the best way to do it is to go pledge that $15 a month over at rec.poker with a premium account. Because if you don't, we have to rely exclusively on our sponsors, like the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino, and Mark Prashant over at Website Amp. Thank you for your support. We couldn't do it without you. We really couldn't do it without our members. That's why we've got the forums. This is the forums edition of the show. So every week we're going to take a hand or a post from the Rec Poker forums and talk about it here on the air. This is a spot brought to us by our very own 5x5 Chris Jones. It's in the Hand Histories forum, and the title is Big ICM Spot, Exploitative Shove. So this is a great subject for us to be talking about right now. As you're listening to this, I hope you're feeling festive because it is now the first podcast that's being released in December. So the holidays are just around the corner. We've been talking a lot over the last little while about 3-bets, responding to 3-bets, ICM. We did an episode recently where Rob took us through Dara O'Kearney's ICM book, Endgame Poker Strategy, that he wrote with Barry Carter. So we're going to tie a lot of those elements together into this post here from a hand that Chris played on a recent pretty deep run over at ACR. So Chris, take us through this spot here and what made you decide to post it in the forum?
Well, this is one of those, we often talk about playing GTO versus not playing GTO. And this is one where, and in ICM situations, how do we make adjustments? This is one where I marked it for study. I made one decision in game, and I'm not sure if it was the right one. So I'll just give you the situation. There are 12 left in an ACR tournament. We've just made a pay jump to 12. The next pay jump is at 9, and then every step up to the top. We've already locked up $1,500. That's great. Yes. Yay. But the top has 20,700. So there's a lot more to win. But we're now in that weird area where there's, kind of that murky area where there's no pay jump that much inside. We've got to get rid of 3 more players before we see another pay jump.
That's a lot of smack of poopies, as my dad would say.
Yeah, I know.
A whole lot of smack of poopies.
And we've outlasted a lot of players. There's 12 left. We are sitting 11th out of 12th in this tournament. So we're short stacked. We're not the shortest stack, but we're not comfortably, into those pay ladders. There's some work to do to get there. And so here's the situation. We have a player at our table who we have 14 big blinds and we're sitting on the button. We have a player who is under the gun. We're 6-handed now because there's 2 6-handed tables. And the under the gun player is opening lots. Like they're as the closer we get to this final table dynamic, they're exerting. They have the biggest chip stack, and they're exerting that pressure, and they are opening a ton. Like just nearly, I wouldn't say every hand, but it's like 4 out of every 6, at least half of the hands they're opening.
That's actually their job.
Right.
Oh yeah, good. Right. Yep.
Right. So they're playing exactly how they're supposed to be playing, but they're opening a lot. So I think that's an important thing to start to consider as we get. So they have 42 big blinds, and they are the table chip captain. The player in the big blind is the other big stack at the table. They have 38 big blinds. So again, we have 14, and there's two big stacks of 42 and a 38, and it's under the gun in the big blind. So one of them's behind of us, and the under the gun player opens. And it folds around to us on the button, and we have King Jack offsuit. Now, if we're playing in a high leverage ICM spot against a GTO bot, this is a pure fold. If they're doing what they're supposed to do at GTO, they're like opening 22% of their hands. I don't know this by heart. I looked this up before I wrote the post, but so they're doing that. This is just a pure fold. Like we just fold it and don't think about it really again. But we've got a player who's not doing that. We've already seen them show down a hand that kind of went one of those where they opened, they got called, and then it was just kind of a middling hand and check. Not a lot of money went into the pot, but they still opened under the gun with Queen 9 offsuit, right? So we know that's one little data point we have on this player. They're at least willing to open Queen 9 offsuit, and that is going through my head as we get to this moment, as it folds to me, and I am highly considering shoving with this hand. And I got to thinking, like, ultimately I folded, but I got to thinking, I marked it for study, and I was like, how wide would they have to be for me to reasonably shove here? Given all the ICM implications, so I did run some calculations, but I'll and I wrote it in the post. But I guess I'd ask, before I reveal that, I guess you've all read the post. So it's about 35% of hands. So that they would have to be opening for that. That's kind of the sweet spot, that if they're opening 35% or more, we can profitably shove in this ICM situation with King Jack offsuit. But even if we know that, should we? It's a hand that's going to be dominated a lot when called. I don't know. I open it for your conversation.
I mean, that's the thing that stands out to me. If you've listened to the show, you know that this group isn't a big fan of King Jack offsuit. It's not a very good hand. It's often a dominated hand, but it does have a certain amount of equity. It's two cards higher than a 10. It's in that category of pretty good hands.
It's
right.
It's better than Queen 9 offsuit.
Right. Yeah. So take it.
Let me ask you this, Chris. When you came up with that percentage, was that the percentage based on the fact that he would call whatever you shoved?
No, it was based on, I ran it in HRC. I did all the pay. I ran this like a full ICM solve.
Okay. All right.
And basically it was saying you got to fold. Like I kept upping the percentage of its range until I got it to tell me to call, and that was right around 35% of hands, where it was like, okay, now you should actually shove this.
Okay, all right. Because I think there's a lot of hands in his range, even shorter than that would probably fold to a jam by you. Yeah. Because I read Kim's post, and she mentioned that she's not going to want to risk that many chips, right? That's like half of his stack, almost half of his stack. So that would be a very big hit to him.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you have a lot more fold equity than you think. King is a blocker. I don't know. A king is a blocker to a lot of the hands that he's going to call with. So yeah, it's a tough spot.
I would also say that this is when you're thinking about making an exploitative shove like this, meaning that it's not a GTO shove. You're trying to exploit your opponent to either call wider than they should or fold wider than they should, one or the other. And you can't wait till you're 9 big blinds or 8 big blinds to do that. You have to do it when your stack is going to hurt them. And this person who's opening so many hands at your table has the chip lead at your table. And if they call and lose, they will no longer have the chip lead at your table. And they are no longer in the position where they can just bully the table and pick up all those free chips all the time. So that gives you the opportunity to sort of force them to fold wider than they should in a GTO world. And you have to do that when you have this kind of a stack size that is going to make a difference. Like you would never do this when you blind down for a couple of orbits and now you're sub 10 big blinds, right?
So the fold equity is an important part of this, Kim, is what I'm hearing when you're thinking about this.
And then when you're called, you're often not in bad shape. You might be up against 10s, 9s, 8s, and you're in a race. You might be up against ace jack, and you're really only in bad shape versus aces, kings, ace, king, king, queen. So, you're not really in horrible shape against most of the range that will call you.
That's the thing about this spot that I was really interested in, and it's a tension I feel in so many poker decisions, but in particularly in this kind of a spot where we know that the hands that they are going to continue with, we're not doing great against it because, like Kim says, we've got king jack, so we don't want to see ace jack, we don't want to see king queen, we don't want to see ace king, we don't want to see jacks, we don't want to see kings, we don't want to see aces, we don't want to see queens, but at least we've got a live card going.
Yeah, I mean queens. We've got some of those. Yeah.
We got 3 outs. Yeah, on that one at least.
With 30%.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, no, that's a ton compared to some of these other hands that we're dealing with. And we're loving life when they do show up with 10s or 9s or some of those other hands, or like ace.
We'll take
10.
that all day.
Even like ace 10 is another good example where we're behind, but we're not dominated in the same way. So
even ace queen, we're like, yes, ace queen. Let's go.
Point. Yeah. And it's easy to imagine them continuing with a lot of those hands. So that makes perfect sense. And there's some money in the pot already. So so I think we really have to appreciate how valuable it is the times that we win this pot when they fold. Because that is how that stacks up really nicely against all the times that they continue and we lose. But as Kim says, we are going to continue and win sometimes when it's a coin flip or even when we're dominated. We are going to win sometimes in those other circumstances as well. Chris?
The other thing that was very top, like, I think if I was, and I think probably in the big blind, this is just an easier decision. But because we have these two players behind us and one of them is also one of the deep stacks, ultimately that's what leaned me towards a fold, because it is a disaster if you shove and get called behind. Like now you're just you're in such dead trouble.
Just because they're only doing that with a very strong range of hands?
Right.
So I have something to say, a couple of things to say about that. I see really good players when I'm playing live now. They will hold back
humble brag
2 big blinds and they will just do a raise instead. Because now if you're going to get a shove and you're on a bubble for a pay jump, you can actually fold.
Right.
And you're on the button, so you have a chance to ladder up here. The other thing I wanted to say was, like, you're 11 out of 12 in this tournament. You have 3 people to go to the pay jump. You're supposed to go out. Like, you are supposed to go out before the next pay jump, which is an incentive to take more chances and take more risks. So, but that's a separate point. That's my point to say that shoving's a good thing. The other point was to say that I've seen people hold back this. You're more or less doing a shove. Like if the original player is going to shove, you're going to call. but it's sort of giving you the chance to, if there's, and I would say that's more likely when you're really closer to a pay jump.
Yeah.
Than 3 away, that now you have a chance that there's a whole bunch of action behind you. You can just fold and make that next pay jump.
Yep. That makes sense.
And that's really something that we should be doing with our entire range there, correct? Like, because you can still get your last 4 big blinds in on every flop anyway. So you're not actually giving up the chance to get those last 4 big blinds in when you want to. But if you only ever do it when you're planning to fold to a shove, then you are kind of opening yourself up to people noticing that and shoving on you.
No, it's not folding to a shove. It's folding to a shove and a reshove.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, Rod, did you have something there?
Well, I was just gonna say, have you seen anybody else fight back against this chip bully? The table bully.
Question.
The only other player at this table that was fairly aggressive had already folded. So the player who was immediately to my right, if you're looking at the chart, Moosey Tunes.
Okay. and then what were you're not too worried about the small blind, I don't think, because he didn't have a lot of chips.
Right.
Not too worried about him. You could call him off all day long. But the big blind now, what was his story? What kind of stats was he? What kind of player was he? Was he loose, passive, aggressive?
I'd say he's kind of a standard reg kind of thing. He's kind of opening. He's like playing a 25-22 with like a, kind of 8% 3-bet range. So he's just a, kind of a.
Do you seem ICM aware? That's the big question I always have when I get into these ICM questions, because we went through the book, the Darrow Carney book, and we talked about ICM, and then we look around as we're playing in these ICM situations, and we see people making blatant mistakes.
Yeah.
If you were considering ICM, it's not a mistake if you're looking at a chip EV situation. So are these guys chip EV guys, or do they really understand ICM? That gives you a heck of a lot more fold equity if they understand ICM.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I was going, that Darrow Kearney book was kind of in my mind about like it's harder to make a shoving mistake than it is a calling mistake in these kind of high leverage ICM spots. So that was another sort of thing pushing me towards. This is one of those where I feel like in the moment I felt like I should do it, but I didn't do it. And part of me was like, well, but God, I'm deep here. Do I wait for a better spot? And if I do this and he's got aces, that's just going to stink. But Kim's exactly right. I'm supposed to go out soon unless I make a big play like this or something happens in my favor and I, get to that point. And I'm going to get a lot of folds with this, and that's going to be really helpful if I do it. I'm going to go from a 14 big blind stack to around an 18 big blind stack. If I shove here and everybody folds, that's going to maybe get me closer to that laddering, point, where, do that again. And things are looking up, at least for me, making it's about a $500 pay jump. So that would be not, something to just sort of sneeze at. So I don't know. One of the responses, Taylor Moss, our good friend Taylor Moss, who's been on a heater, by the way. Oh my God, that guy can't lose. Yeah. So maybe we should really listen to him. He chimes in and says, I would probably fold here. He says, so in this exact hand, I'd just fold. I think King Jack off from this spot at this size, at this stack size is too wide to be shoving. And I think we should be looking to shove a lot versus the big stack opens. But I don't want to have a hand that's going to be dominated by much of their calling range. So that was his take. I think, Kim, your take is go for it. There's lots of reasons to think you're going to be able to make better hands fold. And you're supposed to go out soon. I was probably leaning more towards where Kim was coming from, but then I actually didn't pull it off in game, and I just marked it as one that I think is one to think about. But I do think that in these really, really like key points, one of the things think I need to work on is that I am not a tight player, and I play very aggressively, and I think these are and I know we're supposed to tighten up when we get into, but I think I might take that too much to heart in these ICM spots, and I think I might sort of tighten a little bit too much. But yeah, I don't know. That's all I got to say.
I think having the 2 Broadway cards also blocks a lot of the opening range that dominates you. So, ace king, king queen, ace jack, you're blocking
kings, jacks,
yeah.
Yep.
So, I mean, this is the kind of hand I like for the shove as a bluff.
And in the words of our buddy Keith Brandt, release the Kraken.
That's right. Yeah, Keith's been doing pretty well lately too. Okay, so I've got one question for the group here that we can leave on this one, and we're not really going to answer it, I don't think. But I think some of our listeners and some of the people that I work with in our Wrecking Crew coaching program, some people ask me about spots like this, and they feel a tension between sort of 2 general rules of poker, which is that you're supposed to shove in spots like this to add fold equity so that they're going to fold a lot and you win the pot right there and you get to add 4 big blinds to your stack, and that's a good outcome. But they've also been told you don't want to do things that allow your opponents to play perfectly against you, where they're only continuing with better hands and folding worse hands. And King Jack feels like one of those hands that's kind of on that line where people are going to fold a lot of the hands that are worse than you, and they're going to continue with a lot of the hands that are better than you. So I know we have some equity against those hands when they're called, but how do you guys feel that tension, or is there a tension there? Is it a paradox? Because I try and just explain to the people that ask me about it that it's really about the long run of poker. It's about many more hands than just this one hand and this one outcome that you're going to experience today based on what they're holding this time. But I still understand what they're getting at when they talk about this paradox or this tension, because we are kind of forcing our opponents to play perfectly against us, but we're supposed to be doing that because we're supposed to be adding fold equity to this. And they say, oh, but you're only applying fold equity to the part of the range that we're beating already. Like, you're not applying fold equity to the better parts of their range. So
yeah, but you're picking up those blinds. You're picking up those really valuable chips. That's okay. You're making them fold all their equity. Like you may have 60% equity and they may have 40 with their hand, but you're making them fold their 40% equity, and you're picking up the extra chips. So when you have an opponent like Chris had that's opening too wide because they're opening so many hands, of course they're going to fold so much. You're going to make them fold a lot more hands. And yes, you're going to be ahead of a lot of those, but you're probably making them fold some hands that are ahead of you. Some of their worst ace offsuit aces and things like that. So, and offsuit kings, or even suited kings that are behind.
I think
or ahead. No, not ahead.
You talk about letting the player play perfectly against you. Well, I think of those situations more in the earlier stages of a tournament where you're deeper stacked, where you're allowing your opponent to play well against you, where you're trying to get value or you're trying to get a fold, whatever that might be. I think I don't think that really applies in a heavy ICM situation like this.
Yeah. And I think there are, I mean, you're right. There's a lot of like disaster hands that we can look, if we want to look at the worst case scenario. And there's a lot of hands we talked about, like the 10s, the 9s, the 8s, the 7s, which were just kind of like, great, let's run this. I'll take it. Sometimes I double up and then let's go. Like I'm going for 20K. But I think there's also there are worse hands that will call us here. I mean, I think probably our opponent, I don't know. especially an opponent that's this aggressive, and this player was fairly aggressive. I think they're probably calling me with Queen Jack suited. I think they're probably calling with Jack 10 suited. They're probably calling, so there are some hands that we actually dominate that they may actually call us with. Not that many, but enough that, that would be delightful to see.
That matters. I mean, and I guess that's what I'm getting at. So like, that's why we're choosing a hand as strong as King Jack offsuit and not just like 7-8 suited, because 7-8 suited, you still you benefit from all the same folds of the worst part of their range that they were going to fold to your King Jack. And you still have that underdog equity against all the better hands that they weren't going to fold anyway. You're kind of dominated less, but you're also ahead of nothing. You're ahead of nothing in that straight up equity. So I guess it's the paradox of the blocker, right? Because the blocker means it's less likely that they will continue. But another way of saying blocker in the original Latin is worse kicker. So every time you have a blocker, basically the hand that you're blocking is a hand that has that card, but also a better card than your kicker. So it's not going to happen as often because you're blocking that part of their range. But when they continue, you're going to be dominated more often. So I guess is what I'm hearing from the panel here is that it's still just more valuable to do it with King Jack than with 7-8, because even though you're dominated a little, or with some of the combos that they're going to continue with, you're doing better against their calling range because you're doing better against like the ace queen hands or the ace 10 hands than you are with 7-8. And you can actually get called by worse, which you're never going to do with it.
And 7-8, when they turn over 10s and 9s, or 8s or 7s, you're just like, whereas with King Jack, you're like, okay, let's go. And that's why we often talk about being short stacked in these. We want to really shift ourselves towards that linear, less polarized range where we're really high card value has a lot of value when we are shoving with short stacks, because in short stack situations, they're just really can help us win much more. And the reason 7-8 suited is such a great hand when we're 80 big blinds deep is because we can make a hand and stack somebody with a really disguised straight or a really great, flush draw or whatever. We build with that kind of hand, but it's not going to happen enough. We need to make a lot of blinds for that to actually pay off. Right? When we're 14 big blinds here, that 7-8 suited is still going to make those hands the same amount of times, but we're not going to get paid enough for it to actually be relevant.
And we're not going to choose the boards that we get to continue aggressively on when we just shove it. Like, we get to see all 5 cards, which is great, but there's going to be some boards where we 3-bet with 7-8 suited with a big stack and then choose to shut it down because it's not our board. You don't get that option with this, whereas you're always you always have that in your corner. If at least you've got 2 cards higher than a 10, that's a pretty good chunk of the deck right there. So that makes a lot of sense. All right. Well, any last thoughts on big ICM spot by 5x5 here, or should we?
Jim, what are you doing? We've heard from everyone else except what are you doing?
Oh, get him in. Get him in.
Okay.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I won't say 100%, but I'm thinking is hard. I try and do it as little as possible. So once I'm in like the bottom 2 in a spot like this, I think Kim was speaking my language here, where it's just, if I'm going to win this tournament, I have to take some spots because all things being equal, I'm at the bottom of the pack here, and I say that. I don't know if I really would. It's just, I don't know. It's better than King 10. You know how I feel about King 10.
It is better than King 10.
Yeah.
It's true.
But it's a good, Well, yeah, I guess, I don't know. I always feel like I want to have a good reason for busting a tournament. That's like, I think like all recreational poker players, we want to like have an excuse for why we busted. And I think once you start getting down to this stack depth, you shouldn't get desperate because there is still poker to be played. There's still a little meat on that bone. But I think you should feel like free to take those spots that come along. I don't know. I want to say I should, but now I don't know.
Oh my God. Come on. Let's be real. Most of the time, you're not going to bust on this hand. You're going to make
that's true.
I fold most of the time.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. It's true. It's true.
And if it makes you feel any better, 2 orbits later, the blinds had gone up. So I was down to about 10 big blinds at this point. Small blind I shoved with king 10 of clubs.
Oh, you don't want to do that.
Called with ace 10, called by ace 10, and out I go.
Yeah. That's why you don't play king 10. That's right there. That's right there in a nutshell.
I told you that just to make you happy.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, well, I think Kim, no, you said it. You're right. And I think we do kind of get afraid of the worst case scenario. And Kim and Chris both kind of mentioned that tonight. I think that is a really good point because that happens a small percentage of the time. And there's just a lot more to the story than what happens that small percentage of the time. So,
and we're probably going to bust here a little more than a small percentage of the time, but it's not the majority of the time.
Right.
So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a spot.
Yeah, I think that's true. And listen, as poker players, we have to get comfortable with putting our chips in and losing a large portion of the time. Like that's even if you're getting in as a favorite, if you're getting in 60-40 against another hand, you're going home 40% of the time. Holy God, that's more than a third of the time already. And your hand has to be a lot better than king queen or than king jack offsuit before you start feeling good about what happens after that in the hand. And they just don't make that many good hands. You're not going to get dealt those good hands often enough to just do this with good hands. So I think that's a great point, Kim. Well said. All right. Well, this is a treat. I always learn something on these forums edition. Every time we turn off after the music and we're all just kind of taking a deep breath and decompressing, I always say to the guy, you're like, this is the highlight of my week, man. I just love getting together with these folks and talking poker about this kind of stuff. It gets me going. So thanks to all our listeners for sticking around here. Thanks to Mark Bershon from Website AMP and the Running Aces Hotel Racetrack and Casino. Thanks to Kim and Chris and Rob. Thanks to Steve Fredlin for making this whole thing happen. And you, the listeners, you're the best. We'll see you next week.